Well, hello and welcome back to another exciting edition of Coffee with Stephen. So this week's blog is entitled simply 2A Does Not Apply. And it relates to a case that I'm working on right now. And it just shows some of the sort of pre-existing philosophical mindsets on the part not just of prosecutors, but also of judges as well. So in this particular case, I was arguing a motion to dismiss, essentially making the legal argument that if we accept all the facts of the underlying case as being true, then this court still needs to dismiss the case because the statute that the state is trying to use against my client is, as applied, unconstitutional. So in arguing this, the judge stops me mid-argument and she says, "Counselor, the Second Amendment only applies to law-abiding citizens." Now, this is interesting. In the Bruin test, which we talked about quite frequently, the threshold question is whether or not the Second Amendment even applies in the case at bar. Once that's been established, then the burden shifts to the state, and the state has to now show how this particular law that's being challenged is consistent with our nation's history, text, and regulatory tradition of firearms as existed in 1791. Well, the state has put on an all-fronts war on that first part of the analysis. Does the Second Amendment apply at all? And this is really kind of like focused on two separate types of tests. One is what we call a common use test, when we're challenging whether or not a law as it relates to a piece of hardware is unconstitutional. They ask, is the piece of hardware, is the gun in common use? And there's a whole sort of analysis associated with that. And then there's this question of law-abiding citizens. Does in this case, does the defendant fall within the scope of the people that the Second Amendment is there to protect? Now, the argument has been made that the Second Amendment only protects law-abiding people. And at first blush, that, actually makes some logical sense, I suppose. But that's an interesting sliding scale. When do you lose your Second Amendment rights? When you've been adjudicated as a felon? Well, that's the way it is right now, although there's some challenges to that. What if you've committed a misdemeanor? Is that when you lose your Second Amendment rights because you're no longer a law-abiding citizen? Or perhaps if you've had a traffic infraction, you're no longer a law-abiding citizen. There's no actual guidance on this. More importantly, how long is that right stripped from you? Right? You got a speeding ticket on the 55 freeway and you've now lost your gun rights for the rest of your life. That would seem to be absolutely egregious, but I could certainly see the state making that argument. Now, what was interesting is that in this particular case, the judge was suggesting that the burden was on us to prove that our client was a law-abiding citizen, and therefore the Second Amendment would apply to them. That's just wrong. Okay, I mean, the fact of the matter is it's not our job to prove that the client is a law-abiding citizen. If anything, and I've got real problems with this underlying argument to begin with, but if anything, the state would need to prove that they are not a law-abiding citizen. It's not up to the prosecuted to prove their innocence. That's sort of like an established rule. But as has been articulated with many judges throughout the years, they're making this shit up as they go along. Anyways, definitely encourage you to read the blog. As always, train constantly, train consistently, train repetitively, and train with purpose. Above all else, stay safe.